Chapter 22. America is for Everybody. America is for Everybody, said the U.S. Department of Labor brochure issued in April 1963. The cover showed a young African-American boy, barefoot and dressed in a shirt, and wore jeans, sitting on a dusty railroad track. In the text, President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson described the social and economic progress that African Americans had made since the end of slavery 100 years before. One of the inspirational photographs inside the pamphlet showed Katherine Johnson working at her desk at Langley, already hard at work on the calculations that would one day help send an astronaut to the moon. The same year, that brochure was published. Philip Randolph, the civil rights leader who had pushed President Roosevelt to open more jobs to African Americans during World War II, planned the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, inviting political and religious leaders and even well-known singers of many backgrounds to participate. On August 28, 1963, an estimated 300,000 people marched through the nation's capital, gathering on the National Mall to hear a series of speeches. The defining moment of the event came when 34-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. addressed the crowd. Shortly after he began speaking, Mahalia Jackson, one of the singers who had been invited to perform at the event, urged Dr. King to share his deepest feelings with the crowd. "Tell them about the dream, Martin," she had said to him, urging him to speak to the crowd from his heart. King knew she was right. He set aside his prepared remarks and put both hands on the lectern. He then gave his country and the world 17 of the most memorable minutes in history. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech reminded all the citizens of the nation that the African American dream and the American dream were one and the same. The dream at Langley. In many ways, Dorothy Vaughan was living the American dream. The director of the Langley Research Center sent Dorothy a letter acknowledging her 20 years of service to the federal government. He presented her with a gold and ruby lapel pin during the center's annual award ceremony. By the standards of their families and many associates, Dorothy and the other African American employees at NASA had secured professional jobs in the respect of their colleagues. They were part of the visions that Martin Luther King Jr. and Presidents Kennedy and Johnson had for a more tolerant and just America. But there was still progress to be made, even at Langley. Of all the Black employees working in research at Langley in the early 1960s, there were only 5 categorized as engineers and 16 with the title mathematician, including Dorothy. Langley's director wrote to NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., lamenting that very few Negroes were applying for open science and engineering positions at the laboratory. There is no doubt that one of the reasons they do not apply is they do not believe that the living conditions in the area would be favorable to them because the Langley Research Center, which is completely integrated, is situated in a community where social segregation based on color is still practiced to a certain extent, he wrote. Langley redoubled its recruiting efforts. In the mid-1960s, with dreams of working at NASA, greater numbers of African American college students found their way to the research center. The next generation. When she wasn't at work, Katherine Johnson spent a great deal of her free time at community service activities and at church. After church one Sunday in 1967, Katherine saw a new face in the crowd. She went over and introduced herself to the young woman. She was there with her husband and 2 daughters. "I'm Katherine Johnson," she said. "Yes, I know," said Christine Mann Darden. "You're Joylette's mother." Katherine's daughter, Joylette, had met Christine in college at Hampton Institute. Katherine and Christine had met once before at a sorority function, though they hadn't seen one another in years. Since graduating from Hampton Institute, Christine had started working as a math teacher and had gotten married. Earlier that spring, she had completed her master's degree program at Virginia State University, a Black college, and she had visited the school placement office during her final semester of study. "We wish you'd been here yesterday," said the placement officer. "NASA was here interviewing." The woman handed Christine an application for federal employment. Christine applied, and NASA offered her a position as a data analyst. Once in Hampton Roads, she saw Katherine Johnson and other former West computers on a regular basis, both at work and in the community. Christine had gone to school with Katherine's daughters, and she already felt a connection to her. Christine was part of the next generation of women at NASA, those who would rely on the pioneers like Katherine and Dorothy and Mary for inspiration and guidance. Katherine Johnson invited Christine to join the choir at church. The 2 women got to know one another outside of the office, but they never worked together. Because Catherine was so modest, it would be years before Christine knew the full scope of her work. When someone acknowledged her achievements, Catherine said, "Well, I'm just doing my job." For Catherine, doing her job meant quietly sharing the joy when missions went well as grieving with the others when missions failed. Like the others at NASA, Catherine was devastated in January 1967 when an electrical fire on board the Apollo 1 command module took the lives of 3 astronauts, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and Gus Grissom. The tragic end of Apollo 1 shook NASA to its core. The astronauts had been on the ground inside the module on the launch pad in Cape Canaveral when an electrical spark caused a fire that flashed through the inside of the craft, killing all 3 men inside. The engineers redesigned the spacecraft, carefully discovering then fixing the flaws that had caused the fire. They honored the dead by learning from the mistakes of the past and carrying on with future missions. Each experience offered important information that could be applied to future flights. In the 1960s, the Apollo program, built on its successes, steadily aimed toward a landmark achievement of the space program, a manned mission to the moon. Mission to the moon. The 238,900-mile mission to the moon would take 6 days, 3 days to get there and 3 days to come back. The ambitious plan included 21 hours exploring the surface of the moon for 2 astronauts in the lunar lander, a separate vehicle that would drive across the moon while the service module circled above. The plan sounded simple, but Katherine Johnson knew better than anyone that if any aspect of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon went wrong, the astronauts could be stranded in space, never again to see their earthly home. Years later, Katherine would say that working on the math that coordinated the orbiting Apollo command and service module, one part of the spaceship that would remain parked in orbit around the moon, with the ship's lunar lander, the rowboat of a module that would take the astronauts from the CSM down to the moon's surface, was the highlight of her career at NASA. The leadership of the Space Task Group set a risk standard of 3 nines for the space missions. In other words, it required that every aspect of the program, every part, every plan, every person succeed 99 times out of 1,000. The astronauts were prepared to give their lives to their mission, but they didn't want to die because of a math error. Katherine Johnson worked long hours to make sure the astronauts stayed safe. She arrived at the office early, went home in the late afternoon to check on her girls, and sometimes came back to work in the evening, maintaining a schedule of 14 or 16-hour days. She and the engineers she worked with asked each other what-if questions. What if the computers went out? What if there was an electrical failure on board the spacecraft? What if something went wrong? They had to think ahead, anticipating and solving every problem they could think of before it happened.